Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm with Nick Ayton. I've known Nick for a long time, maybe over 15 years I've known Nick. Nick is a sales professional, an interim sort of transformation director who basically drives sales turnaround and drives profitability. And I thought that'd be really topical given the fact that a lot of people are telling us that their sales numbers are soft at the moment in the UK. And I thought it'd be great to understand from Nick's perspective what's possible, what could be done about it. But Nick, why don't you introduce yourself and give people a bit of background?
Thanks for that, Mark. And yes, indeed, I think it's probably closer to 20 years, actually. But there you go. I think we're both aging okay, aren't we? I think at the end of the day. Look,
I'd like to think so, yeah.
My background's computer science. In the 80s, I had 10 startups. In the 90s and 20s, I worked for some of the big global IT services businesses, running some fairly big P&Ls and big sales teams. And I worked for the big brands, CSC, Capgemini, Siemens. So I've worked for the Americans, the French, and the Germans. So we can touch on the cultural sensitivities maybe at some point. In my journey, I like to design and build things. So yes, one half of me is a salesman, but the other half of me is entrepreneurial, but also a bit geeky. So I've built a fintech platform for wealth management. I got early into Bitcoin, which ended up by building a Bitcoin derivatives platform in 2016, a regulated trading exchange. And then back in the 80s, I even got into engineering a cabin management system for commercial airlines. So quite a different sort of journey. But as most people do, I stumbled into interim or being parachuted in by accident. And that's often the way, I guess. You accumulate a fair number of skills over the years, and those skills become relevant to solving a problem. In the late 90s, I worked with James Champy and Gary Hamel. And Gary Hamel is a professor. He wrote some seminal books about leading the revolution, about how to restructure organizations. And I was all over that in the 1990s because global IT services outsourcing is a form of transformation where you're moving fixed to variable cost. And Jim Champy was the father of business process reengineering. So when you look at the principles of where the transformational movement came from, you could say I was there with two of the guys that founded and led that charge, so to speak. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah. Great, thank you. I think the area that would be great to talk about today would be the sales turnaround space. So the way that I know you is that you move the needle fast.
Indeed. And so it sounds a very simple thing to do, but there's quite a lot in there, of course. So one of the things we should do really is to unpick what is the problem. And you and I both know often the problem is not the problem. The organization is facing a situation. It may be flat growth. It may be declining earnings quality. It could be EBIT, poor conversion rates, and. And generally speaking, when you go into an organisation, you automatically know where the bad smells are, so to speak. So defining the problem is one thing, but I do think it's worth looking at. I like sales top line, top down transformations, and I personally believe they're the most efficient for a whole number of reasons we'll get into. But also it's worth looking at bottom up, because the classical approach of any finance-led or consulting-led is quite often bottom up. So it might be worth just explaining what happens bottom up and why that's not such a good thing as a contrast to top down. How about that?
Yeah, it sounds like a plan. In fact, let's start with that because from a bottom up perspective, there's some pitfalls. And why don't you explain a little bit about what those are and what impact that can have on terms of the successful transformation?
Yeah. Overall, bottom up is quite classical. So what happens is that you'll get, and it's quite often led by the finance department, maybe the chief operating officer might get involved, or quite often they hand it over to consultants to go in and do a sort of an end-to-end analysis of where the costs sit and what is considered costs that can be reduced or cut. And the problem with that, of course, is that it can often be quite arbitrary, and traditionally places like marketing budgets so often a first port of call. You also end up with breaking. So as you're stripping out assumed waste and excess fat, let's say, quite often you're cutting areas that you're going to need later. It's like cutting through muscle. And If you do want to do more sales, you're cutting to areas which are essential for supporting sales. So quite often doing bottom up is very arbitrary. And the big thing is it delivers, yes, very immediate quick wins, but it's very temporary. The impact on EBIT, the impact on the below the line costs is very short term. And that may be fine, but in my experience, what I know stakeholders and shareholders and investors are looking for is the return of sustainable, the quality of earnings and a more sustained recovery rather than a quick fix. The other thing about bottom up is very often it will kill the energy in an organization. It will create fear and uncertainty across the organization. It will damage morale purely because people are sitting there thinking, am I going to be next? Fred and Doris over there have been chopped. Am I going to be next? And that's a challenge. The other area, of course, and we talked about this last time, is the immovable objects, which quite often is the centralized ERP systems that support order to cash, purchase to pay, invoice processing, general ledger. And in my experience, those are monolithic systems that actually harbour friction, time and cost. So quite often the company will say, you can't touch that, you can't go near that, because that's important for us to get our billing and getting our money through the door. So if that's harbouring 40-50% of the cost, where is this bottom-up cost reduction going to come from? So you're going to start cutting into fat and then muscle. So marketing, call centres, customer services. You very rarely cut into HR or procurement because they are bastions that are defended quite vigorously. And then, of course, legal and compliance are again vigorously defended, saying they're essential to the organisation. And all is true, but maybe not to the level that they say it is. And they're all a bit fleshy, these functions. So in terms of bottom up, it's a signalling. And as soon as you go down that path, often the company will go into a death spiral. And from that, you'll get an EBIT recovery, but then you'll end up with a trade sale being taken over, or you'll end up having to recapitalise the balance sheet, and none of which is particularly enjoyable. And then your good people leave, and they'll smell the issues, and they'll get up and go, Mark.
Well, the best sort of commercial recruiters, if they know that a business is going through a bottom-up approach to cost reduction transformation, then will actively target those particular companies to pull out their best people.
Yes.
And there's less friction. They move more easily if you show them other opportunities. So you're right, they lose the best people. There'll be a team of people waiting to approach them.
So really setting the sort of baseline for the rest of this conversation, I think we can touch on two things. What is the purpose of a business? And when you talk to different functions in the C-suite, they often tell you a different answer. The universal purpose of a business is to create demand for their products and services, and then to close that demand, fulfill that demand, and then turn that into cash. And that's called the cash conversion cycle. And what we're talking about is velocity of money passing through the organization. And I can tell you now that when I speak to C-suite quite often, they're not really sure what that means and why it's important. And maybe it's an old school thing. But if you think about it, there are core pillars. So selling things. Without sales, there is no business. And I know certain other functions might disagree with that. But there is no business. There is no money to play with. But it's very important to get that baseline. Is what we're talking about here is the efficiency and velocity of cash in the business and the velocity of sales, because sales generates, even a company that's in the worst financial state, if it can get sales going, it can pull itself out of that state because you've got capital coming through the front door. If you don't have capital coming through the front door, that's another issue. But quite often, poor performance is they do have good capital coming through the door in terms of gross margin and opportunity, but it's being frittered away within the organisation because the organisation is inefficient and the organisation is not supporting your highest margin and highest paying product, service and customers. And this is another conversation that I have with often C-suite, and I guess I have to be careful here because they tend to be your sponsors. But if you ask a C-suite member, what is your most profitable product or service? Quite often they don't know. What's your margins by product suite? Again, quite often they don't know, they're not sure. What's your
Yeah.
actual creditor days? By service line, by product. And the world I came up with is when we had board meetings and management meetings, if you didn't know your numbers, you would be crucified. It's almost like the chairman or CEO would ask you to leave the room if you didn't know your numbers and come back when you're sorted. So I do think that maybe it's an age thing, but I speak to a lot of younger C-suite guys who haven't been through economic cycles. So the ebbs of flow in 1991, the cost of capital, markets drying up, then 2007, 2008 crash. Quite often, when you've lived through one of those cycles, you become aware of what I see as the operating levers of the business. And these are the go-to things that you tweak that help get the business realigned. But quite often, I don't want to bash the big brand consultants, but quite often they'll live in an organization for ages and it's all bottom up. It's all apparently strategic and what have you. And they also don't understand sales quite often, the big consultants, to a degree. So for me, it's very simple. All recovery, helping the patient live, is all to do with sales. And it's all to do with the quality of earnings and the ability to get cash velocity coming through the business. It's no good winning loads of new business if your average debtors are 160 days, which when I did the turnaround and the outsourcing on PwC, and this is the tax and audit firm, when Jim Sherrow was running the business, they had customers complaining, Fortune 500 companies, this is very interesting, that were complaining they wanted to pay PwC but couldn't. And the invoicing was just a nonsense. And they were running PDP-9s in those days and a client accounting time recording system, which was entirely inefficient. And so I spoke to the C-suite team. We moved them on to a new version of SAP, which they built on the time management, time recording system. And we cut debtors days from, I think, 160, 170 days. That's like 6 odd months down to 90. And it unlocked 440 million of free cash flows. And that's a prime example. So on a Friday, what was happening is the partners would come in, fill in their timesheets, and it would go and generate invoices. And the problem is that everyone did it on a Friday and the network would stop because Doris was sending pictures of her baby round and there was no network capacity. So the partners need to bill so they get their bonuses and money. They couldn't get the billing out the door quick enough. And when they did, they had 160 days. So this is an organisation selling performance improvement, which is quite ironic, really, through their consulting arm.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things that has a massive impact, and it's about cash velocity coming through the business. PwC were winning great business, had great clients, doing a great job, but they weren't collecting the cash. So I think really that the measure of defining the problem, you may actually have enough sales velocity and growth. It's just that you're not able to fulfill it. And even if you are, maybe not billing for it correctly. And maybe it's competing against what I would call, because not all sources of revenue are equal, Mark, as you know. The highest value revenue is the one with the greatest margin. But quite a lot of customer revenue comes with almost zero margin because your customer's not prepared to pay for it, and yet they're jamming up your call center, and your best people are, by default, supporting customers that don't value your service. That's a fairly classical thing, and I would say it happens in most companies, actually.
Yeah, I think it does to some degree. I know when we're speaking to clients about sales turnaround, and we're talking about turnaround in general or transformation in general, and I'm always talking about sales-led, because ultimately, if you've got an existing client base, there's more in there. There's more opportunity to get more out of that client base. There has to be. And whenever we've seen transformational change being done within sales, and they've looked at the existing customer base, there's always been an uplift.
So
I've never seen it not happen.
Absolutely correct. So an old buddy of mine, Richard Koch, he used to own LK something at one of the world's biggest consulting companies, and he's a superstar, right? And he's a self-made billionaire, which is good. And he wrote a book called Simplify, and it was the embodiment of what you've just said, because 80% of your earnings, your EBIT, comes from 20% of your customers. It is the 80-20 rule, unfortunately, and it holds so true so often. And another 80% rule is it's 80% more cost effective to sell to an existing customer than a new one. So when you play the old-fashioned game of sticking to the old rules that work, lo and behold, you end up in a much better place. I mean, chasing new business, new accounts has an enormous amount of friction. You've got credit risk. You have to assess them, their ability to pay. You have to go through their compliance and your compliance. It's a longer sales cycle. So you've got higher SG&A as a proportion of revenue. So there is a lot of knock-on effects through. So let's break that down, shall we, in terms of some of the other nuances of sales-led. One of the things I struggle with is the conversation with the C-suite when I tell them that revenue is vanity, complete vanity. And the city don't reward you for revenue. They reward you for earnings quality and consistent earnings quality, and they reward you in other ways related to that. The people who do often reward you are VCs because they're obsessed with market share and growing quickly and what have you. And they always say, oh, yes, but we can manage the cost base later. Well, if you're a pure online business, maybe that's true. But if you're a bricks and mortar business, that's not true. So you have a lot of what I call myths and misnomers in the industry. And let's face it, if you've got 100 customers, it's quite likely that 35% of those customers are killing your business. And it's going to be a fairly large number. And the reason they're killing your business is they're not prepared to pay for your service. Maybe through the sales process, you were screwed down too aggressively. Maybe your cost to serve those clients, because you've got the cost to win them, but also cost to serve. And I was always of the mind when I ran global sales in these big outsourcing deals, I used to ask 3 questions in our bid reviews. Can we win? Big question. The biggest question is it worth winning? Have you done your analysis on what's the pain the organization's going to have to go through to deliver that? And then exactly that. Can we deliver it for the cost and the margin? And can we make money? And bearing in mind, outsourcing are 7 to 10 year deals. So it's a form of M&A in a sense where you're using your balance sheet rather than the customer's balance sheet to sit all the assets. And then you work through over 7 to 10 years, an operational plan that shows how you're going to make margin. So you procure tech cheaper, and then you move your variable costs offshore. And so there are levers that you do. But it all starts with the quality of the customer. So that's where I start. Where is our profit coming from? Where's the quality coming from? And who are our best customers? For the ones that fall into the zero margin or loss making, and they will, and it takes a bit of effort to get the finance department to do this analysis, but it's hugely valuable when you do. But you then have to have the Dear John conversation. And this is why sales-led transformation, we did touch on this the other day, need to be CEO or chairman-led. They need to be CEO-led. And the reason being is it's actually very cathartic for the CEO. And he's seen in front of his customers. And you go and see and have the Dear John conversation and say to your customers, we're here to terminate our relationship. And because we're losing money on you. And that nobody likes having that conversation. But in my experience, that's a trigger for retaining better business. Quite often you will leave that meeting with a commitment from the customer CEO to pay more, to treat you better, and to give you more business. Now, if you don't, of course, well, you say, thank you very much, good to know you, and you move on. By cutting that customer, and typically 30% of your customers may need to go, especially if the business is really struggling, that you have to inflict that level of pain quite often. And then, quite frankly, your EBIT will recover massively when you realign the staff to your best paying customers. So that's how you define where the waste is and the buckets that you don't need. And that includes the immovable object, because if you've got less revenue but higher quality value customers, you don't need such a big office. You don't need such a big back office function, order to cash, purchase to pay. You can slim down maybe legal and compliance and HR and procurement, but you've got a smaller business in terms of revenue, but you've got a much more valuable, higher quality business in terms of its earnings quality, and it's sustainable. And from that base, your cash conversion and velocity can also improve enormously because the customers that are willing to pay for your service are quite often your best payers as well. So the whole thing is quite an interesting mix. But when you explain this to the C-suite or the chairman, what have you, you go through the rationale, the penny drops quite often. And then you then get the sponsorship to do your thing or do my thing. But the last question is how much pain do you want to go through? So, which we can talk about.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's interesting because if you were to speak, if let's say you started an organization and within a few hours, a couple of days, you're having a conversation with the CEO that says something along the lines of, we need to cut out the customers that just aren't paying us right or the customers that aren't profitable. Normally there's a sharp intake of breath, and it takes a really brave CEO to do that. But when you start looking at the statistics in terms of, we see this all the time, we hear of anecdotal examples all the time from our interim managers, that when you go and see those customers and you lay it on the line with them and you're dead straight and dead honest with them and you've got numbers to back it up, and you say to them, it's not profitable for us anymore, we can't carry on supplying you, often they'll say, what is it going to take? You know?
Yeah.
And very often you'll come away with better business,
No,
and the client's
totally.
got a new respect for you.
Yes, indeed. And let me hit you with another bit of thinking here that it's often a challenge of the C-suite. CEOs, CFOs, and COOs are often process strategy, decision making, and let's say the management of the business in different ways. They see the worlds differently. And assuming that a CFO hasn't become CEO, because then, and I've always worked on the simple principles of something called think, feel, know. So quite often, once you understand the personality types of each of the, and I'll give you an example in a second, then what often you find in the C-suite is their inability to agree on things because it's based on inability to understand the other's position. And it comes down to their primary focus of whether they're a thinker, a feeler, or a knower. So let me give an example with walking into a restaurant. I mean, people go, what are you talking about now, Nick? Well, here's the example. A thinker goes into a restaurant and will analyse the menu. And they're looking for value for money. They're seeing how much things cost. Shall I have a starter or not, or what have you? They tend to be your CFOs. They are data-driven as a primary focus. Feelers, right, they sit down, they look around the room, what is he eating over there and what's the special on. So they're energy people, and they quite often manifest as CEOs. They're about vision and energy and energy and feeling in the room. A knower goes in, doesn't look at it and says, I'm having chicken and chips. And that's your chief operating officer. So they're experience-led. They're in the trenches day after day. And all of us have these three traits together, but they are prioritized at different levels. So I'm very much feel as a primary, and then know, and then think. I do the data at the end to back up my decision making. Most CEOs are feelers, but if they go with the deck to the CFO as a thinker, he just wants to see the numbers on Excel. He doesn't want to go through the PowerPoint slide. So the way in which they process the problem is slightly different. So what I've always used, and I've gone into some fairly hostile environments, clearly, where, number one, they didn't want the interim. They think they can do it themselves. You've got various people obviously worried about their jobs. You've got maybe one or two of the C-suite as politicking. Maybe they see it as an opportunity to get rid of the CEO. Little do they know, CEO's job is probably the loneliest job on the planet. And so once you cut that, but you've got to come to some kind of consensus on how you see the world. And that's why when we spoke last time, the problem is never the problem. The problem that it's like back pain. The problem might be in your legs or your hips or what have you. So we often go in, don't we, as interims to parachute it in where the problem is poor sales performance, lack of growth, top line, the order conversion is not happening and you're losing market share. Okay, well, we can go in and have a look at that. But in actual fact, what you'll find is that there's probably plenty of sales, but the organisation is killing them. The bureaucracy and the process for getting deals through the organisation, as we always used to say at CSC, the internal sale is harder than the external sale. Getting approvals and getting through compliance and legals and all of that was always quite hard. So quite often you find is that there is enough earnings quality, there is enough good customers, and they're actually generating demand quite well, but they may not be closing that demand too well, so you can tune that one up. And then they may not be able to deliver it in some way because they're overextending, overselling, or what have you. And then, of course, the last thing, even if they're doing a good job, is that they're probably very bad at billing and collecting the money. So in a service agreement basis, there's always lots of small print about reasons not to pay. You've got to deliver this, buy this, and do this as a service level agreement. Or if it's a product, again, it's the ability for the customer to reject that product or the ancillary bits that says the product's now successfully installed and implemented, therefore you've got to pay us. So it's in there, it's in the mix. And my experience is often is that things are never that bad from a sales point of view. They're focusing on the wrong things, doing the wrong things at the wrong time. But the problem is deep inside the organization, which is killing their cash conversion, killing cash flow, making cost of capital too expensive. And the immovable ERP system monolith is also making it very difficult to optimize the good work that sales are actually doing. I mean, but don't get me wrong, some sales organizations are appalling. You're bang on. It's an interesting scenario.
So I think if businesses are thinking about doing an element of transformation, or they've got soft numbers, and a lot have got soft numbers right now, then don't consider bottom up, consider top down, and bring someone in who's got the experience, who can find out where the real issues are. And it could be that you don't need to do a full-scale transformation.
Yes.
It could be that you just need to look at the small pockets that are not quite working right, and they're a much easier fix and much less disruptive. And you can see something quite quickly. And like we said, moving the needle quickly, that's very possible.
Look, it's not about revenue, it's about earnings quality. So revenue is a misnomer in a sense. It does indicate your ability to sell, but you may be accepting business that is not good business to day one. The key driver is margin and earnings quality, because that delivers consistent performance for the shareholders and the stakeholders of the business. And also consistent earnings quality will ultimately lower your cost of capital. And if you focus on sales velocity alongside cash conversion cycle, then you use your cash more efficiently, and you'll have more cash to deploy on marketing and accelerating demand or entering a new market.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think a lot of businesses are thinking along these lines at the moment, and I can only imagine that this is going to be really helpful. If we've got any sort of chief execs that are looking at their performance and looking at their numbers right now and are a little worried, or maybe getting some pressure from investors, which we know is increasing at the moment, then I think this probably gives them some really good insight into how you can look at it, and that there's people out there that can help.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's all in the mix. It's all solvable. The starting point is get an interim that knows what they're doing inside your business, give them a problem, and they'll come back to you very quickly and say, that's not your big problem. This is the problem, and this is how we can fix it. And if it's CEO led, it's a good thing, right? Because a lot of flat markets in the UK, flat markets in Europe at the moment, we're facing the possible crossfire of tariffs between the EU and America. We've got quite challenging economic conditions at the moment. So if your home market is very much UK and European focused, you're going to have a tricky time, and cost of capital is likely to go up again. If you're more international, then you have more flexibility to play with things. But that then gives you a different operating model challenge, because there's generally two types of operating model. I just want to do this. You can edit this out later if you want, but I just want to do this, right? So typically speaking, there's two types of operating model. One's called a balanced matrix, and one's called an unbalanced matrix. A balanced matrix is where the P&Ls are often country-based. So you'll have a P&L for France, you'll have a P&L for the UK, a P&L for Australia, and so on. What happens is they run as mini separate businesses. So all the products and lines of services, right, report into a head in that country. So you'll have a head of products, a head of sales, you'll have a head of operations, and you'll have a CEO and a CFO in the UK, in France, and Australia. Okay?
Yeah, we see that a lot.
Now, there's a reason for that, because you're playing the balance sheet tax game in terms of moving capital, repatriating capital, and profits. So at a consolidated balance sheet level, you can really manage it, and you see where Australia is more profitable and America is more profitable, and right? But it's a duplication of effort quite often, and it kills your velocity and it sucks cash. An unbalanced matrix is where I moved when I was at Siemens. We went from a balanced to an unbalanced. It was a bit tricky, really, because Siemens is very hierarchical, and they had the Germanic way of doing things is country heads, country units, what have you. But for our outsourcing business, this is why EDS and IBM and all these were so good, is they run an unbalanced matrix. So you have global lines of service, right? So there's no country CFOs all reporting up to a global CEO and a CFO, which happens in a balanced matrix where the P&Os cascade up so you can get a consolidated view. In an unbalanced, you run it by lines of service. And the why that is important, so you'll have a global head of sales, and you'll have country heads of sales, but all the revenue and P&L is rolled up to that global head of sales. You'll have a global head of delivery. And the reason why that's powerful is it exposes waste, it exposes margin. You can't hide so much in the numbers. And generally speaking, unbalanced matrix, you can see where the hotspots are, and you can see where the resources need to go. So if America's doing really, really well, and your lines of, then you start shifting your best people into a new region, but the cost is not covered by the US CEO. He's just a sales P&L, right? The costs are covered by global lines of service. So there is a big distinction here, and quite often you find that the sales efficiency is down to them having the wrong matrix model. And if you have the wrong one, you can't get an efficient sales operating model, because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about, is get velocity into sales, to identify, to qualify, to close, to deliver, to contract, to invoice. It's a velocity game. And you need good data to do that. And your point earlier was well made. Convincing C-suite and the CEO to go for this, you show them the data, you show them the comparison, and that's how you get there. Anyway, just an aside.
The data is so much more available than what it was in the, let's say we're about to go into a down cycle, and some of the indicators are there in the UK. Then the last time we did this was 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago. So the data that we have now compared to then is incredible. So we should be making a lot of these decisions early and not waiting. And I think what we'll see in the UK, if we do go into a down cycle, is that we'll see a lot of companies fall by the wayside. This happens every time we have a down cycle. But the ones that are using data, that have adopted a more technological sort of viewpoint, data, reporting, KPIs tracked against the data, those are the ones that will do well.
Oh, well, it's as survival of the fittest, isn't it? So now is the time to focus on earnings quality, cash efficiency, because that gives you options to survive. If you're running on fumes, your margins are declining, that's death spiral stuff. And when the economic climate changes, it's very difficult to get out, and you will end up being sold, closed down, or as a trade sale. So the incentive to CEOs is there are things you can do, and it's all about sales and cash. And that allows you to ride the economic cycles in a more efficient way.
Yeah, I agree with that. Nick, thank you. And I know we probably talked a little bit more old school, especially in the beginning. Maybe we've just aged ourselves to everyone. But ultimately, I think once you've seen some of these cycles in the past, then actually the old school type thinking is never really far wrong. There's new modern ways of implementing this, and of course we've got data now and things like this, so we can do things at pace. But ultimately, like you said, we're just focusing on one or two things.
Well,
and that's going to make all the difference.
Let me give you a sort of an epitaph to this conversation, right? So, what you say is very relevant, the old ways. But there was Hasso Plattner and Larry Ellison, the COBOL programmers around mainframes, and they're the guys that created Oracle and SAP.
Yeah.
What you have is an ERP system, which is a transaction monitor. It's a centralized monolith. And you have to feed the monster. And it's client server. So the whole sort of monolith inside your engine is aimed to push products and services to your customers. The world doesn't want that anymore. The world wants to be able to pull products and services, and they expect you to offer personalized, individualized experiences so the customers, in a sense, can design their own journey and experiences. They also expect you to have sensors inside and across your organization that looks at where the customer is in that journey to detect that you need help or support or things are working or not working. So the world is moving to pull. So you have this is why digital transformation struggles, because you've got client server Web 2 world, and then you've got Web 3 pull world, are completely incompatible. Business process, computer messaging, they can't coexist. And what you end up is digital transformation is, what I always say, is lipstick on the pig. You're not actually changing much. You're just trying to, let's say, put a facade on that shows the customer that you're doing all of these things, but the engine is still a four-cylinder 1930s Model T Ford. And that's the point. The reason the old ways work is because the heart and soul of your systems, IT, are old systems. And I will maintain that the world still runs on mainframes. Governments, airlines, banks still run on mainframes. ERP systems are a centralized monolith that enforce inefficiencies on an organization. Complete inefficiency. I remember having a meeting in Vevey with the CFO of Nestle, must be 20 years ago, and they're the world's it used to be the largest SAP implementation in the world. And the CFO is sitting there and he said, I've got 23 operating balanced business model, 23 P&Ls. And he said, you know what, the SAP, I can't get a trial balance. I cannot get a consolidated view of my business by pressing a button. And yet I spend 1.3 billion on SAP. I had 400 ABAP programs, which were all the sort of moves, adds and changes, sort of that change the code, right? And he couldn't get a trial balance. And he said, we can't get rid of it either. We can't move away from it either, because that is the business. And there you go. The immovable object in these interim assignments has to be understood and has to be known. And it's a graveyard of failed business transformation because the immovable object gets in the way. And what I'm advocating when you do sales-led is actually, to a certain extent, you don't need the immovable object anymore. You need the ability to invoice clients and collect the money. Yeah, that's what fintech and digital banks do. Yeah. Obviously, you need to audit the transactions and collect the transactions, but you can do that with a Web3 front end. You don't need ERP to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing that in a lot of companies now that are going into older industries and delivering something which customers say is revolutionary. And this is allowing the customer to pull, not a push. Utilities industry or something like that. A lot of changes happening in there. And that's because the customer's allowed to pull.
Exactly.
Not push.
Yeah.
It makes a big difference.
Massive. And that's the competitive advantage that I'm in Dubai this week, and one of the biggest digital bank in this region is called Weo Bank. They've got 1 million customers. It's a big bank.
Wow.
And you're seeing, the other challenge is that industries, let's look at insurance. Why doesn't insurance, I worked in the insurance, I was on the board of exchanging, we run the Lloyd's markets, right? And insurance, you think about the carriers, the people who design the products. An insurance product is designed, but they don't know if they're going to make money until the claims come in. So it's entirely speculative, right? But they also build in fat because it has to be sold through brokers to retail, or it has to be sold through brokers to commercial. So you're building fat into a product day one because the industry is inefficient. What we really should be doing is selling the insurance product direct. But the structure of the industry, which is also ERP based, is they're sharing data and information between all the layers in the industry to reconcile their ERP system, which is adding even more friction, time and cost to the entire industry sector. That's why insurance premiums are going up through the roof claims does have a role, but it's actually the inefficiency of the industry where everyone's feeding from the commission trough. So when you ask why don't industries change, well, there's a reason. But then a new people will come in. Like there was a German company called Lemonade, I think, where they allowed you to buy insurance by the hour. And you could do it online.
I saw that.
Yeah. And so therefore you come in with a different model. I did it in the pensions world. When in a fintech platform, we built a platform. It was around workplace pensions and auto enrollment. And the pensions regulator said, look, we want to push small and medium-sized businesses to offer their staff a pension, a contribution pension. They were looking for service providers to do that. So we looked at the pensions industry, and for example, L&G, it would cost them about £200 to acquire a pension member because the cost of marketing administration. And then it would cost them something outrageous, sort of the same thing to serve a pension member. So in other words, collect the data, do their annual reports, send out their P60s and what have you. And we thought about this and thought, well, it's not a pensions issue, it's a payroll issue, because pension is a tax wrapper around payroll. So we built a system that allowed small businesses to upload their payroll, lights out, and our system then set up a trust document. We never touched the money, that went through trustees, set up a trust document, and then this IT system then set up all the investment accounts by member automatically on the back of one digital signature. So the cost to acquire a pension member was 55 pence, not £200. And the cost to serve was £1.50 per member per month. And we won 60,000 customers, but we had 60,000 members in a blink of an eye because it was easy and it was self-serve. Small businesses could pull the service and just upload a payroll form. That's the example in the room, is that these industries are inefficient. So if we're talking about a company that's in trouble or is struggling, we also have to bear in mind the industry stack that they're in and what's going on in their industry stack, and also what are the innovation and early adopters and the new business and the startups that are nibbling away at the fringes of their industry with a different business model.
They come fast.
Yeah, you may be wanting more sales, but you're also defending against new competitors, which weren't there 6 months ago.
Very true.
You know?
Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, Nick, thank you very much for your time, sir. I think what we've done is, I think we've definitely fully explained the sort of top-down model. But I think this is really topical, given the fact that we're hearing more and more every day about soft sales numbers with a lot of companies at the moment. And I think because of the space we're in from a digital perspective, AI perspective, customers pulling, we're in quite a unique position at the same time. It could be that some industries are just flipped on their heads, like we've seen in, let's say, the utility industry with Octopus and companies like that. A lot of this is coming. And I think from what you're saying, it's act fast. It doesn't have to be a full-scale transformation. It could be pockets of things that you can change. But ultimately, you need to start acting.
Do something.
Yeah, do something. Brilliant. Nick, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thanks, Mark. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.